Great. So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again all for coming today, and thank you for attending this second panel. If our first panel attempted to really focus in on the economic, the business issues, the energy issues in Venezuela today, now we're really trying to focus in more on the political issues and think about issues of participation, inclusion, democracy, and maybe even eventual reconciliation is really the focus of this panel. We have a very distinguished group of panelists here who can provide very important perspectives on policy towards Venezuela, opportunities for movements inside Venezuela to take up the important task of reconciliation, and maybe for the role of the region to also play a role in this process. So let me introduce our three panelists. First, furthest to my left is Mr. Juan Cruz. He's the Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. That makes him the President's advisor on all matters related to the Western Hemisphere. He helps formulate, define, and implement interagency policies for the region. He prepares the President for interactions with foreign leaders. He joined the National Security Staff in May 2017 from the Department of State, where he had held several high-level positions in the Western Hemisphere and Latin America. These include overseas postings in Brazil, Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, Peru, and Venezuela in over 30 years plus of government service. He is a proud holder of a BS degree from Georgetown's University School of Foreign Service, a master's degree in international public policy from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and the executive leadership certificate from Northwestern University's Kellogg Graduate School of Management. Juan, welcome. Next, we have Professor David Myers, an associate professor emeritus of political science at the Pennsylvania State University. He's a comparative politics expert with a focus on the Andean region of Latin America and Brazil. He takes special interest in urban politics and political parties, which is much what he'll be speaking about today, and elections. He's the author of 8 books, including The Unraveling of Representative Democracy in Venezuela. He received his PhD in political science from UCLA. Welcome. And finally, to my left, Michael Shifter is the current president of the Inter-American Dialogue. His main responsibility there is to provide insights about the region. He's been cited by the media in such venues as Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, the Harvard International Review. Prior to joining the dialogue, Mr. Shifter worked for the National Endowment for Democracy as a senior program officer for the Latin America and Caribbean programs, and in the Ford Foundation as an officer for the Governance and Human Rights branch. He got his PhD in sociology from Harvard University. He was a regular professor here at Georgetown for us as an adjunct. We hope to bring him back sometime soon. And he writes a great deal about Latin American issues. So in this panel, what we'd like to do is think about, as the last panel, diagnosing in some ways the current situations, but especially with that eye towards looking forward, especially trying to think about what are the prospects for political reconciliation in Venezuela. What would a peaceful negotiated settlement look like? What is the status of political parties today, and what role can they play in the future? What lessons might be drawn from other countries' processes of reform? And especially, how can the international community best support human rights and reestablishment of democratic norms in Venezuela? What could the international community do to reconstruct the economy and the society? And so much like the last panel, we'll allow each of our panelists to offer about 10 minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll proceed to questions and answers. And so we'll begin with Mr. Cruz. And maybe, given your role, you could especially talk about the role you see for the international community, but in particular for the United States at this particular moment in Venezuela's history.
Perfect. Thank you, Father, and thanks to Georgetown University for pulling this together. We've got a battle of the Venezuela sort of topics in town in the last few weeks and even today. So I congratulate you for bringing a group that is meaningful and different than some of the dialogue that's taking place elsewhere. So as you said, I think my value added is to talk a little bit from the administration's perspective and how we view things, not just from the NSC and the complicated interagency process, but also from the administration, the president's view. And the first issue of political reconciliation and the reason for the negative environment is probably the right place to start, and it's probably, believe it or not, what I believe is one of the easiest issues to address, because it all is based in the regime's insincerity, and that's why we can't move forward. It's the difficulty in reaching peaceful solution is a lack of desire to reach a peaceful solution. The Venezuelan regime is bent on remaining in power at any cost. And to do that, they're willing to play with the instruments of democracy to remain in power. I also think they've clearly demonstrated that there's no interest in political reconciliation. They've used every opportunity that they've had, not just in recent failed talks in the Dominican Republic, but a history of failed talks that has enabled the regime to lower the temperature internationally, kick the can down the road, and perpetuate the situation that we live today. And it's no accident they've created and elevated an illegitimate constituent assembly, inconsistent with the Bolivarian Constitution of 1999, and then created a set of institutions that make it impossible for the opposition to operate in a level political playing field. Everything from an National Electoral Council, which is stacked with regime officials, and a Supreme Court that is unfair and one-sided, and then, of course, the blatant attempts to bully the opposition, whether it's at the negotiating table in the Dominican Republic or elsewhere. And if there's something that's keeping the regime in check, and this is something that I think a sentiment that you'll hear from various corners, is the issue of sanctions, whether they're U.S. individual or sectoral sanctions, or those sanctions that come from Canada or the European Union, two entities, by the way, that are not trigger happy when it comes to sanctions. It's a very deliberative process, and let's face it, Canada doesn't sanction unless you need to be sanctioned. It also rolls into the value of the issue of the political parties. I think the opposition has been resilient under terrible conditions. And so the future of political parties in the reconciliation process in the day after, not just political parties, but I would say political movements and civil society, will be paramount to whatever the solution is in Venezuela. At times, the opposition has been accused of supreme disunity and even of subverting one another. But I have to take my hat off to the opposition for their ability to jiu-jitsu in Santo Domingo, where they proved that unity was a way to repel the bullying of the regime and to avoid a bad deal. And the repudiation of the inflexibility of the regime and the negotiating tactics that were used against them was only successful because they could do it together. And I marvel at the opposition's ability to do this and persevere in an environment that is a subverted political process, where we forget that we may all want to play by democratic rules, but the regime is ultimately a dictatorship, and so those rules can shift and change at will. If you were a member of the opposition and you knew, excuse me, that whatever you did could result in detention, harassment, abuse of you, your family members, your businesses, then I think it places a special price on the courage that has been demonstrated by the opposition in anything they do in Venezuela. On the question of where have we seen this before, and are there any lessons learned, that question caused deep thought. I'm anxious to hear from folk in the audience, but I think I ultimately ended up in thinking that it's difficult to find a case exactly like Venezuela in the hemisphere or outside. You have a country that, in essence, has been discussed earlier, is a country rich in resources, and that in the past has probably been the most successful, economically successful country in the region, to where we find ourselves today. One of the poorest, if not the poorest country in the region. And this is not an accident. This is a result of cumulative effects, everything from incompetence and mismanagement and supreme hyper-corruption and a failed economic system. If I wanted to be provocative, maybe to open the way in the question and answer period, I could do something I try to stay away from in our region, which is to draw parallels and comparison where they may not exist. Recently, with the elections in Honduras and Chile, I saw a bit of forced comparison in, well, are we seeing something that we should compare to what will happen next in elections in Brazil or Mexico or Colombia? I think that's a facile and comparison and an error. And so at the risk of committing that error here, I'd throw out 4 countries for comparison that maybe if anyone's interested, we can be provocative in the question and answers. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Panama. And then lastly, I mentioned something about the international community and the opportunity they have to support human rights and the support of democratic norms. The solution to the situation in Venezuela will require every one of us. And when I mean every one of us, the entire globe, as many countries as possible, every institution. And the day after scenario, likewise, the calamity that's befallen Venezuela, its institutions, infrastructure, agriculture, agro-industry, so on and so forth, will just need a Herculean effort by the international community. We can get into it with greater detail, but I'd say that we've seen quite a bit of leadership already, but I think we need to move away from what all of us agree are the circumstances and then find a way to underscore that in a louder voice and have that voice heard. We have to remember that Venezuela has undergone a number of changes over time that we've let take place, to include press censorship, so the message is not getting to the Venezuelan people. And more importantly, they're shutting us out. So the international community has a lot of space to increase pressure diplomatically, economically and socially, and to affect positive change in Venezuela and help rebuild what's been destroyed over time by this regime. And in whatever the solution is, the solution will be a multilateral one, will be one hopefully of peaceful transition, and will be one that will take a long, long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful remarks. Professor Myers, could we think some then about, again, diagnosing the situation, telling us a bit about prospects for the future? And I know you mentioned you might focus in a bit on political parties as well.
Yeah, right. I'll try to do that. I just did recently two long essays in the Latin American Research Review trying to look at some of the questions about why Venezuela was going the way it was going. And in the process, I, believe it or not, ended up in one reviewing 6 books and the other another 6. Now, one of the things, this forced me to go back and look at my own trajectory in Venezuela. And I was part of a group of people in my generation, which is back a ways, that went down to Venezuela with great hopes that you were going to look at a country that was going to eventually end up in the first world. And I remember I was at the, had an office, or a desk is an office, it wasn't, at the Ministry of Public Works. And I remember Leandro, what was it, Leandro Mora said, why don't you come out to my fazenda during the weekend? So I went out there, and on the way up through the mountains above Caracas, I was surrounded by about 25 guerrillas. Which didn't exactly make my day. But the entrance was that somebody from Leandro's fazenda came out and said, let the guy through. And so I went through, and we spent the weekend there. And so afterwards, I went back to Caracas, and the guerrillas surrounded me again, and they said, you know, please, this time I was about, you know, was 22 years old, so that's a long time ago. They said, we're sorry that we did that. We didn't mean to excite you, get you upset. And I finally was talking, and they said, well, we were the guerrillas that were developed by Acción Democrática during the Perez Jiménez government, and that what we're here for is to reconstitute ourselves because Castro's are going to try to take over Venezuela, and Acción Democrática wants to stop it. And of course they did with those guerrillas. The Castro sent some of his guerrillas in, and they were wiped out by the AD guerrillas. And that was the beginning of the Punto Fijo stability. The Punto Fijo system lasted from about 1958, 59 up until about 1999. Now, I jumped to the other end, and 2 years ago I was down in Caracas doing some interview on political parties, and I interviewed Marina Corina Machado, who is a leader of the opposition, and we had breakfast together, and I spent some time there talking with her. And then she went on her way, I went on my way, I went back to my hotel room, and then I went down to Data Analysis, which is the big public opinion center, and to spend the afternoon there. When I came back, one of the people at the hotel said, "You realize that Serbine demanded entry to your room." And I went into my room, and I found that my computer, my laptop, had been broken into. I was totally unusable. It made me a little bit concerned about the whole situation. Those are the sort of the two bookends that I use, because I think there are two things to remember about the long-term trajectory of Venezuela since the late 1950s. One, there are two very competing and very different rules of the game there. One is the liberal democratic rules of the game, and the other is a rules that will talk about itself as being democratic, but is basically democratic in the socialist communist sense. And remember that the guerrilla movement lasted in Venezuela from about 63 up until about 70, 71. And it was brutal. It was very brutal. They took out a lot of people that were, well, let's put it this way. After Betancourt came to power, what happened is that Fidel came and he expected an alliance with Acción Democrática. Betancourt went one way, and he had an alliance with the United States. I think there was basically a deal that he would support the United States on the Cold War with the Soviet Union if the United States would support him in terms of his control over Venezuela, because there'd been coups and things in 1946, 1947. So what he then did when he supported the United States in the Cold War, and attempted also to have more of an open democratic regime, people broke off from AD. There were two breakoffs from AD, and some of these people went into the field. There was another breakoff from COPE, and of course the communists felt that they couldn't possibly stay in if part of AD broke off, so they went into the field. And it wasn't until 1969, 1970, when Caldera came in, that was set. And still, if there was some guerrilla activity during the 70s. Now, Jorge Rodriguez and Delcy Rodriguez, who are both very strong pro-Chavistas, very much opposed to the liberal democratic system. Their father was one of the people who was involved with the guerrillas during that period of time, and he was killed when he was in jail. And that's an indication that there was never a reconciliation between the people who looked at democracy in a very different way, using the socialist view of democracy much more than the liberal democratic view of democracy. Now this turned out to go all the way through up until the 1998 election, I'm sorry, when Chavez came in. And after Chavez had tried the coup and it didn't work out, and then Caldera pardoned him, Chavez disguised somewhat what he meant by democracy in the 1998 campaign. I remember I was doing polling at that time for MAS, and MAS supported Chavez. So one of the things that I used to do during 1998 is I would brief Chavez. So I spent a fair amount of time talking back and forth with him. And after he was elected, I remember having a chat with him, and he had just come back from the Quebec summit. And if you look at that picture of Chavez in the Quebec summit, he's at the very back, and in the front is President Bush and the leaders that were around him. And Chavez was totally marginalized. And Chavez said, he told me, he said, you look at that picture, he said, they will never do that to me again. They will never do that to me again. Because he was absolutely convinced, then he said that remember, Chavez was a graduate of the Universidad Simón Bolívar. This was a university funded by the United States in the 1960s and 70s to produce an anti-communist intelligentsia in Venezuela, and its most prominent graduate was Hugo Chavez. I always thought that was a bit ironic. So this was a person who knew a lot about political science and political science methodology and so on and so forth. And he said, I talked with Bush, he said, and he has no understanding of social democracy. All he wants to do is talk about liberal democracy, and I don't think it's going to work. Then, of course, soon after that, you had the attempted coup against Chavez. And when that attempted coup against Chavez came, I think any interest Chavez had in opening up dialogue disappeared with the other side. And the end result was, I remember I was an observer on the 2006 election, and I ran into him. I was an international observer at that time. I ran into him up in La Pastora and chatted the last time I ever chatted with him personally, briefly, and he said, I still believe that you guys don't understand that liberal democracy gives wealthy people a chance to play the interest groups, and the interest groups are always going to screw the poor. And that was a very interesting and perceptive comment. So I guess all of this says to me that during this period of time of the liberal democracy, where you had A.D. and Copé, the far left and the people that looked at the more socialist or even communist view of democracy felt they were excluded. And that when you got to 1998 and there was a crisis, they did allow open competition, and Chavez won. They will not allow open competition now. And I think that's very, very clear. That my evidence for that is, if you look what happened down in Bolivar, Andres Velázquez won the election. And when Andres Velázquez won the election, they said, well, we have to do a recount. And when they did the recount, it turned out that the Bolivarian candidate had actually received the most votes. And it was very clever what they did. I've been told, and once again, I have no absolute proof of this, that with Tibisay Lucena, the Electoral Council gave total everything that they have, they gave to the Cubans, and the Cubans have their own Venezuelan Electoral Council that allows them to play around with the electoral votes and produce the type of results that they want. They did that the first time with Tony Ledesma. Remember when he was elected alcalde mayor, and Chavez and the Chavistas said they had to have control of metropolitan Caracas. And so what they did is they just basically changed the rules and did away with the power of the alcalde mayor. So once again, I do not see any real chance for reconciliation until the Chavistas and the military, which is so tied to the narcotraficantes, actually feel that that's the only option to avoid being thrown out of power. And that's the only way they're going. Now let's quickly look at the political parties. I guess I don't totally agree with Juan on the parties. I think the opposition is a disaster in Venezuela. I think they have as much chance of winning the election as a snowball chance in hell, to use polite language. Anyway, I mean, if you look, Henry Ramos allowed, when the governors got there, he allowed them to take an oath of office to the Constituent Assembly. Then he got so much pressure from his own people, his base, which is the only group of people that have any base that I can see, are what's left of the old AD party. Premier Justicia, it was the old Jesuit part of Copé. Copé was always, on one group of people, you had the San Ignacio Jesuits and some of the people from Fundación La Salle, and then you had the good old boys from the Llanos, from the plains out there with Herrera. And all the Jesuits more or less went into Premier Justicia. But once again, Copé could never win an election without the good old boys from the inside. And I don't think that Premier Justicia will do anything. You've got Nuevo Tiempo, which is basically what existed of ACT. I remember when I was in Zulia, and Juan Guanipa, who was the candidate, was a member of Acción Democrática. And, he won the election, but he refused to swear allegiance to the Constituent Assembly. They just said, okay, you can't be the elected governor. They held a new election and put in somebody else. So the thing, every time, and of course popular will, you've got Leopoldo. Leopoldo is he has very serious doubts that participating in elections without more guarantees is all that useful. And I remember talking with him when he was mayor of Chacao, and he said these people will never surrender power. And he said whenever it's close, they'll resort to violence against the opposition, and I'm not sure what we can do. And he told me he organized Consejo Comunales in Chacao. Now, Chacao is sort of like the Beverly Hills of Caracas, if you want to put it that way. And so he organized, according to all the rules, the communal councils, and they had anti-Chavista majorities. Well, what they did is the government came out from Caracas and countervened from downtown Caracas in Libertador, and organized other community councils. And then what they did is all the resources to develop grassroots were given not to the community councils that were developed in Chacao, but to the community councils that were sent out by the Chavistas. And then he told me my organizer, who had developed them, was headed back to the back home one evening, and he had a motorcycle, and he was just picked off, killed. And he said 2 or 3 of my best operatives were killed on the way out. So once again, unless these people see that there is no option for them remaining in power, I don't think they'll go. And of course, this means I think the United States has to be willing to provide security somewhere on the planet for some of these people, because the types of things they've done, they would be strung up if you had a popular revolution in Venezuela. Now, in a sense, I think the best chance for a change in Venezuela comes not with the opposition, but with possible fissures inside the PSUV. I mean, where will they be? Clearly, Maduro and Cecilia and I think Tariq are very tied with the Fidelista group in Cuba, because of course the competition between the Raúlistas and the Fidelistas in Cuba is being played out in Venezuela. You go up into the well, if you visit any of the maneuver units of the Venezuelan army, they all have minders. If you remember the hunt for Red October, and remember they got in the submarine, and before they were going to bring it over to the United States, they had to kill the communist minders in that. I mean, every maneuver unit that I've ever had any experience with in Venezuela or known anything about has a Cuban minder at that point. So I think you would I don't think you can break the power of the PSUV. You have to go for a fissure. Now, what would happen then, let me try quickly then to go to two other things. I know I'm going too long here. I would think that what you've got to do is somehow break the tie between the military and the PSUV, which is a very difficult thing. For years and years, and I was on the faculty at West Point, and I served a brief time as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Latin America back in the dark ages when Gerald Ford was president. I remember that the military in Venezuela was the closest to the United States of any military in all of Latin America. When Chavez came in, particularly after the 2000 coup, his thing was to break the ties with the U.S. military by involving the Venezuela in the narco-traffic trade. And right now, with the decline in oil prices, much of the money that keeps the Venezuelans, the military, loyal to the PSUV is the fact that they're working with the narco-traffickers. So I don't know now if, for example, you would get a fissure inside the PSUV. I don't know whether Ha would be a possibility. Aristobolo Istoriz is another one. Now, he's one that is definitely not trusted by the Fidelistas. If you saw when Maduro clamped down about a year and a half ago, he got rid of Aristobolo as vice president and brought in Tariq al-Assami. And, you know, Tariq's wife is very much involved with some of the Iranian terrorist group. Wife's family, not her personally, but the wife's family is involved with some of the Iranian terror groups. If you had that, the other fly in the ointment is that the whole area south of the Orinoco is basically under the control of the drug lords. And the question is, if you had a government that was cooperating internationally and operating and attempted to crack down on that, what would happen? Because the drug lords are increasingly allied with the ELN. Many remember when Raul was very involved with the negotiation of the FALN, but the Fidelistas never liked that, and they had much more control of the ELN. And so what's happening now is you could have what would be a model. One model would be Afghanistan, where you would actually have the international community tied with the central government, but you'd have half of the country under the control of the drug rulers, and that, of course, would destabilize Colombia. So once again, that's a great problem. The final question, and I will speak.
I think maybe we should proceed a little bit, and we can come back to it in question and answer.
Yeah,
because I want to make sure that we allow time to get some questions.
Right. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No, thank you very much. Yes, Mike, would you like to continue? And you, I know you've been looking at this from a number of perspectives, and especially, I think, often convoke discussions that bring in multiple actors from multiple sides. So maybe thinking about the perspective you've gained through those conversations.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody, and thank you, Matt, for the invitation, and thanks to Georgetown. It's great to be here. I've been affiliated since 1993, so it's a pleasure to be back, and thanks to the business school for also. This is a very timely conference. I hope I wasn't invited to offer the optimistic perspective on the political situation. It's obviously very difficult, as we've heard from all of the speakers so far, and as you said in your opening comments. Clearly, the best scenario would be a negotiated solution, a reconciliation. We've seen this elsewhere, and why not Venezuela? At some point, that there may be some sort of negotiation, but certainly not now. We're at a very, very, very low point. And why is it so difficult? Well, it's difficult because, as has been said, Venezuela, I think I agree with Juan. It is a distinct case. It's very hard to make other comparisons as much as people try, and I applaud those efforts, but they fall short because Venezuela has three characteristics that it's hard to think of another country that has. One is the nature of the authoritarian rule, but we can think of other cases of authoritarian rule, but this is combined with a very high level of criminality and corruption, and steeped in the drug trade and other illicit activities. And it's a major oil producer. And it's hard to think of other cases where those three features come together, and that makes it, I think, particularly challenging. But let's not forget it. Ramon told us about the picture, the oil picture, and down to 1.7 million. Well, yeah, that's been a dramatic decline, but it's something. And I think if one were going to ask the question, why has the regime been able to, despite all of these crises, been able to survive to the point it has oil. Just, even though the sector's in total crisis, it does have that natural resource, which enables it to go forward. The government clearly is, the opposition has asked for free and fair elections on April 22nd. or another time when at an appropriate time, when they can have free and fair elections. It's clear that the government is not going to accept that, because we know if the government accepted that, it would lose. It would lose power. And it's not going to lose power. That means, I think both David and Juan agree with that. 90% of Venezuelans have a negative evaluation of the country. Maduro's popularity is about 22%. More than 82% want him to end his term now. Clearly, if there were a free and fair election and opposition leaders were not disqualified from running or not in jail or whatever, the regime would be in serious trouble, and there's a lot at stake for the regime. There's a lot of talk about fractures within Chavismo and defections and all that. And after all, Chavez himself still has about 50% of approval, and Maduro has 20 or just over 20%. So there's a 30% difference between the two, and that sort of suggests that there's some real differences and real fractures within the ruling party. But at the same time, a lot has been made of these differences, defections that we've seen of some major figures. But when the time comes, there is this tendency to close ranks, and to close ranks because if you face the prospect of giving up power, that's not something that I think any of the leaders are about to do. Even though we can cite individual examples where that has happened. The government now faces a dilemma, and it looks like it's just going ahead and just gonna go with these elections on April 22nd. They're going to be rejected by the international community, rejected by obviously most of the Venezuelan opposition, and so forth. Or it could decide that it would continue autocratic rule or authoritarian rule, a single party rule, but try to moderate a little bit and to try to at least be accepted in sort of the community of nations in the region and globally. My guess is that they're going to go for the first. They're just going to double down and barrel ahead, and they don't really care about the costs and whether the costs. Having said that, I think it's important, and you asked us to talk about opportunities and moving forward. I think this talk of having a mega election, which now is going to happen, it looks like, with the having a new National Assembly, could be a very serious mistake by the government. That highlights important fractures and differences between Maduro and Diaz-Cabello. Was also a very powerful figure in Venezuela, and this could separate the ruling clique of Maduro and Rodriguez and some of the others from the rest of Chavismo. And this goes to David's point of what can happen. So this could all potentially blow up in his face, and we just shouldn't rule out that possibility. And he may be overestimating his own strength. So that, I think, is something to watch very closely moving forward. But even if the government were to succumb to its own contradictions, which are many, on the other side of the ledger, the alternative is not very encouraging. The mood has, I think, demands have been reasonable, justified. I'm sympathetic to what Juan says, although, I think some of the points that David makes are also on point. But, these negotiations are not going to work because having free and fair elections means Maduro giving up power, which he's not going to do. And the opposition can't keep talking if Maduro's stalling and playing games and kicking the can down the road and all of that. And opposition has their pressures from their constituents as well that they have to respond to. There's a lot of disarray in the opposition, largely because of the authoritarian practices of the regime, and sometimes very skillful. Chavez was very good at that. Maduro's proven to be pretty good at that as well in dividing the opposition. And the opposition now has no clear leader, no clear strategy. and sharp differences of how Venezuela might be governed in a post-Chavista government, when that were to happen. So there are differences. Their decision to boycott the elections is totally understandable. And I know there were differences of opinion. There was a fierce debate inside, and people have different points of view. My own sense is that, that now it does relieve the pressure on the government a little bit, and now Maduro doesn't have to steal the elections as much. And the record of boycotts in the past hasn't really led to very positive outcomes. So it's hard to see how this will produce that, but there's enormous frustration, and I think there's clearly understandable and justified the position they take. There may be other figures who will run. There already is an evangelical pastor who's announced, and maybe Henry Falcone and others he's not going to run. May run as well, but clearly, this looks like that Maduro is going to get reelected for another 6-year term. I think we're seeing the deterioration likely to continue for some time. I think the mood itself may be superseded, and it may be a moment to look at a sort of a broader coalition of opposition, renewal of leadership, and a new generation in Venezuela. This has been a long period. We're talking about 1998, as David said. We're now in 2018. So it's been 2 decades. And however one assesses the performance of leaders, it may be time for a new generation and to go beyond the mood and to try to have a broader kind of basis for political action moving forward. So I think there's going to be greater, unfortunately in the short term, greater instability, suffering, and I think even if one were to force oneself to come up with the most optimistic scenario for Venezuela, which one should do as an exercise, and I'm sure you do every day, it's going to take a very long time to overcome the rancor and bitterness and polarization and the scars that have developed for 2 decades. Let me just a final word, and then I'll end on the international community. International community has had a response that I think has been delayed, overdue, but now clearly there's a widespread condemnation of the regime we see through the region, and Juan mentioned the sanctions in European Union and Canada. I think the one thing we learned about how effective international pressure can be is it's probably only as effective if there is some internal organized, coherent opposition to deal with. It's very hard for there to be effective political pressure. You can do all of these things, but if there really is no organized alternative, that makes it more difficult. It's not impossible, but I think if we look at different cases, that's what we see. The regime clearly feels the pressure. I think you see that in what they say and how they act. But they have international backers, China and Russia, for 2, which is an obstacle for any effective action at the UN because they have veto power. And Nicaragua, Bolivia, it's not much in the region, but there are 2 countries. And they still have that 1.7 million that Ramon said, which is terrible, but not nothing. So I think the focus now really has shifted to the migration issue and the exodus from Venezuela, which is massive. And talking about comparisons, it's maybe useful to talk about Syria as a comparison in terms of the refugees in Venezuela. I think there's a comparable case to look at Syria and look at Venezuela, tragically, and I think the support needs to be on certainly helping other neighbors, Colombia especially, but also other countries in dealing with this incredible problem and challenge. And I hope that the United States and other key players will continue to support Colombia and to deal with this issue, because it is dramatic, it's tragic, and I think is where we're going to see the attention focused in terms of trying to relieve this tremendous humanitarian suffering and crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you all three for those really helpful remarks. Why don't we begin taking some questions? I'm going to suggest that we take two at a time, so that will allow hopefully more questions to be asked. And when you raise your hand, please hold it very high each time. Let's start in the back, right back here with Monica, and then...
Hi, I'm Monica from the Center for Latin American Studies. I was surprised actually to hear that the Maduro government has 21% of approval rating. There was a report published 2 days ago saying that like 64% of the population lost on average 11 kilos. I mean, if you compare to what's happening in Brazil, like last September, Michel Temer, for much less cause compared to what's happening in Venezuela, his popularity rate was like 3%, right? So what is the source of this support for Maduro? Why is his government has that level of support, right? And also, if you were to advise the neighboring countries how to deal with Venezuela, what would you say to them? Because you have many cities in northern Brazil are being overwhelmed by the migration. Of course, the Colombia case is much worse, but they do have a history, Colombia and Venezuela, from migratory movements, right? That's not exactly what has happened in Brazil, between Brazil and Venezuela in the past, so it's a new phenomenon taking place. What type of advice would you give to these countries? Thank you.
Great. We had one more right up here in this section. I thought I saw a hand. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is John Ettinger. I'm a student in the Center for Latin American Studies. My question has to do with the reaction of the international community, as you all referenced. How do you account for the difference in the tone and the strength of the reaction of the international community to what's happening in Venezuela, as opposed to, for example, what just took place in Honduras, where we have evidence produced by a professor from Georgetown and other sources of significant meddling in that election on the part of the incumbent government? So I'm just curious about what you would say accounts for the difference in reaction between some of these differences we see in interference with the democratic process in different countries in the region.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. So why Maduro's numbers in the 20s? I think you can't stop it at Brazil and Temer's 3%. Maduro's numbers are higher than the presidents of Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and so on and so forth. So I don't like to look at those numbers. And why it's institutional. People have benefited or feel they have benefited from the Chavista revolution. And in fact, I would turn that around and say that's a good way to look at the situation. We have to be very careful about criticizing Chavismo. I think you focus on criticizing Madurismo. And it's just, we can fight that battle another day. But I think there's just, Chavez did do things for an underprivileged class, or people feel that he did, and there's an allegiance there. As far as the migration issue, you know, whether you take the numbers of 30,000 or 35,000 or 40,000 in Brazil, you're talking, that's relatively an insignificant number. I hate to put it that way, but if you look at the 500,000 in the United States, 500,000 in Colombia, twice as much, 70,000 in a small country like Panama, which is only 3+ million people, then you get a sense of, you know, a country the physical size and population of Brazil probably can take care of 35,000 people in its own resources, even if it is in a remote place like Boa Vista. And to go to the question of the outrage over the significant meddling, I would quibble with that vocabulary. If you kind of delve deeper in it, we don't want to make today about Honduras, but there's two issues that I would distinguish. One is there's a discrepancy between two monitoring organizations, the OAS and the EU, of how they define what took place, and neither of them said that there had been a disruption of the democratic system. What they said was one said there was a potential and you need to prove that it happened. The other one said you had to prove that it didn't happen. But there's no evidence that it happened. The potential that it could have happened is what's out there.
Would either of the two of you like to respond?
Yeah, I would say the one thing I would say about Maduro, why does Maduro have over 20%? And I actually I saw this morning that his numbers went up, was going up to like 24, 25%. Is I think you can't underestimate, and I think many people have the ideological conviction that a large part of the population has, as bad off as they are. And obviously there's overwhelming discontent by the majority of Venezuelans. There is a sense of there's a revolution. And we got to stick with the guy who Chavez picked to continue the revolution, even though they don't like him, they don't like what's happening in the country. And I also think it has to do with, what else do they see as options? And so they're not, it's going to take a long time for any opposition force to restore the public's faith in their ability. They're seen as having made a lot of mistakes, having had opportunities, and not really. So there's a lack of confidence, and that benefits Maduro. So I think there's a little bit of that. But I think the ideological dimension should not be underestimated. I think that's part of the explanation. I do think on the Honduras, on sort of the double standard question that you're asking, I mean, I think, yeah, it is a different nature of, the nature of the democracy crisis in Honduras is different than the democracy crisis in Venezuela. I think this is a much greater dimension. And people just, in my experience watching different crises in Latin America and the responses by the U.S. and responses by others, what tends to happen is that you tend to be consumed by one issue. And when other issues emerge, it's very, very difficult to sort of muster and summon the same amount of energy and response, and especially if it's not as kind of as kind of dramatic, and also talking about the role of the opposition. Nasrallah has said that that he recognized Juan Orlando Hernandez. And so there's a kind of a sense that, well, they don't like this, they feel that it was cheated, but they kind of, so if you don't, also, it goes back to the issue of internal domestic oppositions. That's important to explain why the differential response of international communities.
Why don't we go ahead and take a couple from this side over here. So why don't we start over there, and then we'll come back with Luis, if that's okay.
So, Alberto Alfonso, and my question was that it's a sort of a two-faced question, if I may. The first one is that, Mr. Myers, you mentioned that there has never been a conciliation between the ideological divide in Venezuela, and most likely there is not one now. So I was wondering, what is your take on the role of justice and reconciliation committees and commissions in the future, as in trying to bridge that divide? And then linking to that is what you, Mr. Shifter, mentioned, that there's a huge divide between the popularity that Chavez still holds and the one that Maduro has. And I'm of the school of thought that Chavismo is going to outlive Maduro for at least decades or more. And that itself, then, with that prospect of Chavismo remaining a political force in Venezuela, what do you think the future of governance is? Would it be juntas? Would it be a rainbow democracy as we see in Brazil, which we later found out it was a fraud? But are we going to be linking towards fractions in every political party, or are we going to have a Chilean transition where they remain in power somewhat in some level until they died out? Or what is your take on this?
Let's go over here to the light blue shirt that was back in the middle.
Hello, I'm Luis. I'm a student in Latin American Studies. My question is that given that ELN guerrillas and FARC dissidents are operating in Venezuela, what do you think are the implications for the Venezuelan political situation with the Colombian upcoming elections, especially concerning that a leftist candidate, Gustavo Petro, is leading the elections, and the Colombian far right has been very hesitant to implement the peace accords So what do you think are the implications for the Colombian elections?
Please.
I want to start with.
Yeah, okay, on the first one, on the, in terms of the justification, and I really don't see any immediate ability to have a rapprochement between the two groups. I just think they're too far apart, and I think that right now the Chavista group is too powerful. Now, one possibility would be if the international community were truly united in that situation, but it's not united. You want to remember, and I think Michael mentioned this, you've got the Russians, and you've got, to some degree, the Syrians and the Iranians, and for different reasons, the Chinese, who are also backing the Chavistas in many ways at that point. I mean, and the coordination, it's hard to know. There is a signed document in which if you are a Cuban soldier, you can serve in the Nicaraguan army, you can serve in the Venezuelan army. If you are a Venezuelan soldier or military person, you can serve in the Cuban army and the Nicaraguan army. Now, as long as those types of things, now the Nicaraguans are much more marginal, but the Cuban-Venezuelan connection is very strong, and the Russian-Cuban connection is very strong. To get the Russians to come aboard, I think the Russians are going to demand something. What the Russians are going to demand? They're going to demand a change in some of the U.S. policy in Eastern Europe. They may demand a change in certain things in the Ukraine. They could demand a change in things in Georgia. And I'm not sure the United States is prepared to make that type of a change. I mean, what we're seeing now is that Venezuela, for the first time that I've ever seen, is actually now coming up into great power politics in a way that it didn't come up before. So you can't really deal with it alone using the Latin American perspective. Now, in terms of the final thing, the ELN in Colombia, the last time the guerrillas in Colombia abandoned, this was in the 70s and so forth, a lot of the guerrilla leaders who were running for office got shot. And there's been various people in the left that have been shot. And to some degree, a lot of people have said, well, we really don't want to go with this election, that what we're really going to have to do is go back to guerrilla warfare. And there's a difference between the support that's coming from, I think, from the Fidelistas inside of Cuba and the Raúlistas. Raúl really was very strong on the peace process. The Fidelistas really much opposed it. And, I don't know. I mean, if the narcotraficantes control and continue to control the south of Brazil, and they have ties with the ELN, that is a potential long-term factor to destabilize Colombian politics. It really, and it's very, very, very dangerous for political stability in Colombia. It's still in the beginning. We don't know how it's forming right now, I think.
Michael or Juan, would you like to respond?
Sure. Look, on the first question, what's it going to look like? Who knows? I mean, I think one way to think about it is the comparisons some people have made with Peronism in Argentina, that this is this is going to be a force that's here to stay. How much, whether it's as powerful as Peronism in Argentina, I'm not sure. But this is, I think, going back, the politics to go back to pre-1998, I think is unlikely. I think this is going to persist at some level, which means that, other political forces are going to have to sort of recognize and deal with Chavista in some form, Chavista party or movement in some form. I think that's going to be the nature of politics moving forward, even under the best scenario you can imagine. On the Colombia issue, I think the Colombians, all the polls show that they hate Maduro more than the Venezuelans do. This, I think, could potentially be very much of a play for the candidate of Álvaro Uribe of the Centro Democrático. That will be decided on March 11th in a consulta, and we'll know who the candidate is. But clearly, if the Colombian government is having, had negotiations with the FARC, as you know, Uribe has talked about Castro Chavismo, and I think that this gives that message a little bit more resonance. ELN is operating out of Venezuela, the FARC's in Venezuela, and Santos, to pursue his peace agreement, had basically a rapprochement with Venezuela to enable him to get the accord. And those who were critical for him being too soft and too gentle and too accommodating to Maduro these years, I think may get political advantage.
There's very little I would add, except maybe to say that if we become comfortable with the idea that transition, that in Venezuela the solution is prefaced with the transition government, that you need to think in terms of Chavistas light. There are a lot more Chavistas than there are Maduristas. Maduro did not come from a grassroots effort. He was an anointed one, and thus it becomes a situation where his own control within the party is, I would say, iffy. And you have people that have already been mentioned, such as Aristobul Isturiz, who have been political chameleons over time, but could offer something, that kind of Chavista that has credibility and has been vice president, has held all sorts of roles, could be the kind of people that could usher in a transition of some sort with folk across the table.
Thank you. Why don't we do one more round of questions, and we'll take 3 this time, and then I'll ask both our questions and our answers to be somewhat brief. Why don't we start here with Pedro, and then we'll go to the back there.
Pedro Borelli. I want to talk a little bit more about kind of the elephant in the room of narco-trafficking, and in the context of what Plan Colombia was 16 years ago as the formal government of Colombia asking for help to recover kind of access to part of the territory and to be able to have the whereabouts, the military capability, the intelligence capability to basically give this country, Colombia, a chance to survive. It is very clear from the sanctions itself, I mean, who and what the sanctions have been. There have been a lot of people who have been sanctioned for narcotics trafficking, for money laundering. It is very clear that a great part of the territory, as mentioned by Professor Meyer, the south of the Orinoco is almost territory we've almost lost control, and there's all kinds of illegal activities with the FARC and the ELN quite involved. So my question is, if we are dealing, like Ambassador Haley said at the UN, with a narco dictatorship that's also quite violent in the way that it's dealing with anybody who's opposing it, are we actually, is the diagnostic correct, and are we trying to look for the correct solutions? Is trying to dialogue with narcos that are, on the other hand, being sanctioned because of narcotics, and watching the country being taken over by these people, are we actually applying the wrong medicine to the problem? My sense is that if you have a very severe tumor, you don't give the patient aspirin. And I have a sense that a little bit of what's been going on, a lot of the discussion in the Dominican Republic and the participation of Mexico and Chile and the foreign ministers that came from the side of Venezuela, was kind of a repeated expectation. This had failed. The talks had failed in 2002, 2003, and 4, failed in 2014, failed in 2016, and it's always for the same reason: this is an increasingly criminal regime. All of its top figures have been identified as being involved in the narcotics business, and we're trying to get them to behave as politicians who are willing to negotiate and come up to some kind of coexistence with a majority of the population that doesn't want them there. So the idea is, are we making a mistake? Do we keep just going around missing the elephant in the room, talking about politics, talking about the quality of the opposition or not, talking whether it should be united or not, and we're actually dealing with the regime that is actually exactly what Plan Colombia tried to avoid in the case of Colombia. 15 years of work to try to avoid the FARC and the narco traffickers from taking over the country. It turns out in Venezuela that has happened. So
thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting question. We'll go back here to the back right here.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Deborah Oliveros. I'm a student at the Communication, Culture, and Technology program, and I'm Venezuelan. We've heard from all the panelists about the role of the government and the international community, the military, and other countries, but we haven't heard about what is the active role of civilians in this situation. In the last 2 decades, we have seen many movements, student protests, and some of them were planned and organized, some were spontaneous. I was wondering if in this scenario, is there possible for an active role of civilians, or if it's simply out of their hands? Because somehow, even though they have been strong and popular, there haven't been like strong change, at least political change in Venezuela.
Great, thank you. And we'll take one last question. I thought I saw your hand over here, right over here. And let me just say, by short answer to that question, the next panel will be taking that up in some detail. So I think you'll probably get some good answers there as well.
Hi, my name is Jeff Ramsey with the Washington Office on Latin America. I just had a question for the panelists here. Secretary Tillerson has made clear that sanctions on the Venezuelan oil sector are on the table. And we know that there's been certain rejection of this idea from other countries in the region. There was a poll that came out actually from the Atlantic Council conducted by Data Analysis that found that 80% of Venezuelans reject oil sanctions. And I'm wondering why or what the panelists would see as the justification for this measure, considering that there is this hearts and minds issue and the potential for this to be used as political fodder by Maduro, and also the very likely humanitarian impact that these would have.
Great, so I'll let you all take a chance, or have a chance to answer.
I'll take a start. So I'll start with the last question first. It's not just Secretary Tillerson. We've said from the beginning that all options are on the table, and that is the case with Venezuela. We can't give ourselves the luxury of removing possible tools that could accelerate the resolution of this situation. I'm curious as to, I heard you say that the rejection of this in the region. That's not my experience. In fact, the opposite. We've had to deal with an overwhelming pressure from the region to do this, and tried to figure out a way, because we have been very diligent about enacting sanctions of any kind. If you see, they've been used in a surgical way and not a heavy and blunt instrument, and every person has undergone a tremendous scrutiny from all sides. That's why you see these things. Some people have criticized us of doing it in dips and drabs, but the absolute truth is that we're very responsible about how we do this and want to get it right. And paramount to this is to do nothing, or to do things that don't hurt U.S. businesses, U.S. people, or the Venezuelan population. And but this is a risky business, and you can't do something without risking something. The piece about 80% of the Venezuelan population rejecting this, I think is accurate, but we also have to remember that Venezuela lives a press censorship, and so they're making their decision based on half-truths. In terms of the humanitarian consequences, if we chose to do something like that, that's precisely the calculus that we're looking at, how to make sure that it would have a minimum consequence, in a humanitarian fashion, and how to help resolve it if it did, because all these things have second and third orders of consequence, and we take it very seriously. In the piece about civil society, then I'll pass the baton to someone else, and what else can be done. I think that clearly there's been an insufficient piece that has to do what civilians can do. In my experience in something like this, we were talking about this earlier this morning, usually the diaspora overseas in situations like this takes on a bigger role, and you can feel and sense the diaspora's movement in support of what's happening inside the country, outside of the country, whether that be in places that are heavily populated by Venezuelans in Europe or in this hemisphere. But I think that that's an area of growth and opportunity for Venezuelans who oppose the regime. And no one took me up on my offer early on to discuss the four countries that could offer a lessons learned. So I'll draw one from you. Give me the opportunity on Panama. And part of Panama's success was precisely what you've mentioned: civil society from across the board, from all walks of life, everything from church groups to businessmen groups and so on and so forth, of all political stripes and no political stripes, coming together and to oppose an unjust regime.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll quickly go through, once again, starting with the thing on should we just sanction oil? I mean, you know, as Juan said, the big thing is what's the humanitarian impact of it going to be? So, and basically, I think people don't want to play that card because of the humanitarian impact. They think about it very carefully. The other thing is, once you've played that card, what other cards do you have left to play? Maybe there are things you can play on the way up to playing that particular card. So these are decisions that obviously are being made both in state and the intelligence community. In terms of getting together the community, I would argue, yeah, you've got to, but you have to go with the institutions that are organized. My impression is that the best organized institution that is not being co-opted by the Chavistas in Venezuela is the church. And the church might be able to use its influence, first of all, as a funnel for aid and maybe to help eliminate some of this terrible crisis with medicines not coming in food and so forth. And my impression is that the Vatican, and you know, Father Carnes will know this and other people much better than I do, that they're looking for some type of an option there. So I think I really think the church is the only organized group in Venezuela that could possibly have an impact there. Final thing about what Pedro was talking about, I mean, it's very clear that you can't deal with what's going on in Venezuela without dealing with the narco problem. Now, how are you going to deal with it? You can't deal with it as ideology. It's purely money. It's purely Godfather type of things. And, you know, how do you deal with it? You know, it's going to have to be by a combination, unfortunately, of force and bribery. It's my feeling. So, you know, that's not in my area. I don't know how to do that.
Michael, we'll let
Thanks.
you go
Okay,
ahead.
thanks. Starting with Pedro's good question. Yeah, I mean, the drug issue, as I said, is a dominant issue. Is it the only issue in Venezuela? I don't think so. There's also politics. There's also authoritarian rule. And if you look at, it's interesting, you mentioned the Colombian case, Plan Colombia. If you look at the negotiations with the FARC, which, you know, we can talk about, you know, how successful they were and so forth. But, I mean, that was exactly what people said about, you know, why do negotiations with the FARC? Because it's the biggest drug cartel in the world, immersed in the drug business. And yet, you know, for 2 years or whatever, they talked and they handed in their arms. And with all the problems that I recognize, and I'm sure you know, that's a step. And there's, you know, the armed conflict with the FARC is over. Violence continues, security continues, all of that. And the drug trade is, as you know, is thriving in Colombia. But you know, there is a political aspect to it which leaves some possibility for some sort of negotiation. On the civil society issue, well, you have two, as Matt said, we have two superb panelists on the next session who are on the ground and know this very well. I would just say, from my perspective, that we have seen a lot of movement of student groups and other groups, but I think there's an exhaustion factor, there's a fear factor, and it's just, you know, it's demoralizing to, you know, when you sort of don't really make any progress. But I mean, you know, whether that will come back in some form, I think we'll hear from our experts. And just on the final thing about sanctions, I mean, look, I think that I'm very skeptical for the reasons that you cited in your question. You know, I think it could, you know, as bad as things are in Venezuela, don't rule out the possibility that it could be worse. And oil embargo could well have that effect. And it's not going to hurt the regime, it's going to hurt ordinary Venezuelans. And I also think, you know, Maduro will use it as a political tool and say, look, I told you, they're conspiring against us, and this completely vindicates what I've been saying all along, and this is evidence of it. They're not buying our oil. Having said that, as we've heard so far, there aren't great options and solutions. And I would not, you know, Juan said that the Latin American governments are sympathetic to this. In your conversations, I wouldn't be surprised if you hear that. I doubt you're going to hear a lot of public enthusiasm for this idea in Latin American capitals. And for one reason, for several reasons, but one I would highlight is Cuba. Cuba is the case where there was, there still is, the embargo. That's been going on for a long time, and it hasn't really had very positive effects. And that's an issue where the Latin Americans, I think, have been united against U.S. policy, and they applauded the opening. And so sort of the idea of the Cuba experience, I think, is not irrelevant to how Latin Americans are likely to react to the idea of an oil embargo against Venezuela.
Thank you very much. We have a very robust conversation. Let's thank our panelists, please.